Hello, this is Peter Falk, and you're listening to the Columbo Files on the Ludic Lounge, hosted by Antonicus, Maximus, and John Soares.
Hello, dear listeners. This is another episode of the Columbo Files brought to you by the Ludic Lounge. This is John Soares, your ever-present host, and with me, as always, is the man, the myth, the legend himself, Antonicus Gluteus Maximus IV, Anthony to his friends. Anthony, say hello, folks.
Hello, folks.
One of these days, I'm going to make you say something funnier.
You know, I might actually change my name to like Antonicus Cassidy after his great performance in this episode, John.
And by Cassidy, Anthony means the great Jack Cassidy, who is among the cast this week for the official post-two pilots Columbo episode, 1971's Murder by the Book. This is the first episode of season 1 of Columbo and is guest starring as our murderer, following the ever-present Peter Falk, who I think at some point we might have to do just like a dedicated episode about Peter Falk so we can gush about him.
Oh, that's fair.
Because I think the people deserve a little bit more background on the great Peter Falk. But joining us this week as our murderer is the great Jack Cassidy in his first of 7 Columbo appearances, Anthony.
Wow.
3 of which he was the murderer. So this is his first appearance, his first time as a murderer, and we will, again, check back in when we come across him next. And maybe we might do like an appearance ranking for him.
Ooh, that would be a great idea. I think that's mightily grand.
That might be something to get into.
I think I might already know my first overall, but I won't spoil it. I'll wait for that episode.
Yeah, that's farther down the line once we actually have all of these appearances. So, now that we've introduced Jack Cassidy, do you want to get into the cast, Anthony?
John, I would love to. So Jack Cassidy is playing character Ken Franklin in tonight's episode, and he is known for majorly being a TV actor. Alongside his 7 appearances in Columbo, he also starred in Hawaii Five-0, Bonanza, Bewitched, Get Smart, and tons of other things, John.
So, in other words, if you watched Nick at Night at a certain period of time, you probably saw Jack Cassidy.
You know what? That's 100% true, actually.
I know. And in addition to his TV work, he was a noted stage actor. He won the Tony Award for a show called She Loves Me. And you've probably heard of this show, Anthony, because it serves as the inspiration, I believe, is the source material for the Tom Hanks Meg Ryan movie, You've Got Mail.
Interesting.
So for those of you at home, Jack Cassidy is essentially Tom Hanks.
I can see that.
I can see that. Though I don't think Jack Cassidy would call himself America's sweetheart like I think Tom Hanks is kind of rightfully earned.
That is fair, John. And speaking of things that we could see him as, one thing that you can't see him as is his one credit in a film role where he stars alongside the likes of Clint Eastwood in The Iger Sanction, John.
Now, Anthony, tell me about The Iger Sanction. Who stars in it? What's it about?
Oh, boy, John, I would love to tell you all about this movie. So let me give you the highlights. Clint Eastwood in this movie. Oh, my gosh. I don't even know where to begin. So Clint Eastwood, John, I kid you not, plays an art professor. Okay.
Okay. I can buy it. It's Eastwood.
It's a 1975 film. I should probably start off there.
Okay.
He stars alongside the famous George Kennedy, who plays character Ben Bowman. George Kennedy himself, big-time character actor, He was known in Cool Hand Luke, The Naked Gun 2.5. He was in Charade with Cary Grant, Audrey Hepburn. Very huge character actor, John. So Clint Eastwood plays, as I formerly mentioned, an art professor. But John, he has a checkered past.
Oh, boy. Is this based off a Robert Ludlum novel?
You know what? I think it is. It might be, actually. So Clint Eastwood is, alongside an art professor, he was a former assassin who has to get back into the game to hunt down a mountain climbing assassin.
I'm sorry, a mountain climbing?
A mountain climbing assassin. They don't know the assassin's name. The only thing they know is that he's going to be climbing Mount Eiger. And so Clint Eastwood has to go climb this mountain. And it's one of 3 people that can be this assassin. And so he has to figure out and keep his life in all these people's hands, because they are climbing a mountain with I think it's called a lifeline, like a line that goes between all the people who climb a mountain. I couldn't tell you because I'm not insane. But yes, and Jack Cassidy plays like a rival of a sense. I believe he gets killed in this film. I never watched this film, so I'm not 100% sure, but he makes a star appearance alongside. But this movie, I watched the trailer, John. It looks like a big pile of mess, and not in a good way.
Oh, boy. Fun fact, it was apparently based off of a novel by a guy named Trevanian, who I've read one of his books. He wrote a book that gets referenced in the first John Wick movie called Shibumi, which is about an assassin who has to come out of retirement to take revenge over somebody who wronged him. And funny enough, apparently it was a rumor going around that Trevanian was just a pseudonym for Robert Ludlum. So my Robert Ludlum thought makes sense.
Yeah, totally works. So that was the one sole Hollywood film that he's credited. He did a lot of TV movies, Jack Cassidy, of course, that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And also...
Are you going to go where I think you're going? About the dynasty of Cassidys that came out of this man?
Absolutely. I was going to toss it to you on that, sir.
Yeah, so for those of you at home, the name Cassidy might sound familiar. Jack Cassidy is the father of...
Ba, 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 ba. I think I love you, and I don't know how to tell you.
I think I love you, but what am I so afraid of?
Oh, could be. I might have messed it up. It's okay.
Anyway.
I was trying to do that on purpose so we don't get barred on YouTube.
I mean, I appreciate that. Jack Cassidy was the father of David Cassidy, who was a teen heartthrob and performer and actor on The Partridge Family. His brother also was one of the Hardy Boys. His brother, Sean Cassidy. Sean Cassidy was David Cassidy's half-brother through Jack's second marriage to actress and singer Shirley Jones, who was the mom on The Partridge Family.
Really?
Yeah. So David Cassidy was acting opposite his own stepmother. And more currently, David Cassidy's daughter, Jack Cassidy's granddaughter, Katie Cassidy, can be seen on the CW, primarily in the now finished show Arrow. She played Laurel Lance, the Black Canary, among other numerous credits, but that is arguably what she is most known for in the last 10 years, or 5 years at least. Her uncle Sean Cassidy now is a writer and producer for TV, and he's still working. Some things about Jack Cassidy. He suffered from bipolar disorder and alcoholism. And unfortunately, I believe his alcoholism primarily led to his rather tragic death. He fell asleep, I think, after coming home from a bender, and had a lit cigarette in his hand, and caught the house on fire. And unfortunately, he was killed in that fire.
And the only way they identified his body was because of the special house ring that he wore and passed down to his family and his own brother. Which makes an appearance in this episode and every other Columbo episode, but that's unfortunately...
I thought I saw it when I was doing the research and I saw that ring. I was like, is that the same ring, or what are you taking it off?
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure it's the same ring.
They also identified him through his dental records and the ring. From that, I think we can move on to the first of our victims.
But
or do you have anything else?
I want to also mention that Sir Malcolm McDowell, they played him in the David Cassidy story in the year 2000.
Yeah, and I guarantee you, if Jack Cassidy was alive, he probably would have played himself.
Absolutely. I don't see why he wouldn't have. So
I actually have one more thing because I think this is kind of interesting. According to David's memoir and Shirley Jones's memoir, Jack Cassidy was bisexual.
Really?
Yeah, and apparently had a number of flings in Hollywood. I only bring it up because it was corroborated in two different places. Considering the time, I'm surprised they were willing to be that open about it. But I don't really have much of the context on how it's presented in the memoir, so hopefully it was a positive and not necessarily, curse him for being this.
Yeah. One can only hope.
Yes.
But moving on to our first of two individuals murdered, we're going to talk about Martin Milner, who plays Jim Ferris.
Now, in this episode, Martin Milner and Jack Cassidy play a writing duo who write mystery novels. Martin Milner, and it's appropriate that it's Martin Milner because he was a frequent TV actor starting from the early days of TV.
1947, John, is when he started.
That's unbelievable. And he was acting like for the majority of his life. His biggest starring roles, however, came with the road show Route 66, starting from 1960 to 1964. The premise of that show, which I think is kind of amazing, he played the lead role, and he was left penniless by his father. And because of that, he takes his Corvette, and he drives across the U.S. doing random jobs with his best friend. That's the whole show, and wackiness ensues. What's notable about Route 66 is that it was all shot on location. So a thing about Martin Milner is that he was driving up and down the states doing this show. Wherever Route 66 took him, he would go, just because that's what the show needed.
That's amazing.
I know. And it also comes into play on the next show because it kind of got him hired for it. He starred for 7 years, 7 seasons, from 1968 to 1975, in a police procedural that was produced by Jack Webb of Dragnet fame, Adam 12. He was the lead officer, or the lead character of Adam 12. Pete Malloy of the LAPD. The show literally followed his career for 7 years. When you first meet him, he is literally probably like an hour out of graduation from the police academy. And he was chosen by Jack Webb primarily because he was a young man and all of that driving experience he had on Route 66.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does, doesn't it? And do you have anything to add about Mr. Milner?
I do. One thing that does not make any sense that I just found out in research on here, he also starred in a TV adaptation of RoboCop, John.
Now, I knew there was a RoboCop cartoon, which in of itself is insane. Because that is a movie that would not be watched by anybody who watched that cartoon.
Yes, absolutely. But yes, it only ran for 1 season. It was 23 episodes in the mid to late 90s. And it was, and Martin Milner played as the father of the titular character RoboCop, Alex Murphy, I believe.
Do you remember Rambo got a cartoon?
What?
Yeah, Rambo had a Saturday morning cartoon. Rambo, of all things.
Wow.
I mean, to be fair, it was the 80s. It's Reagan's America, down with communism, that kind of thing.
What would that sound like? Reagan just so happening himself finding a Saturday morning cartoon of Rambo.
Nancy, I think it's time to watch the Saturday Morning Funnies. What do you say we turn on that tube there and watch ourselves some cartoons, huh, Nancy? There's that remote. Oh boy, there's a big buff man shooting at the Russians. I like this. What's his name? Is his name Rambo? Oh. Oh, Nancy, this is I tell you, Nancy, this is the way to go. It's like it verged on Kermit and Minnesotan somewhere.
Yeah, the longer it went on, but I enjoyed every second of it.
It became its own freaking character.
So Martin Milner, to make an awkward transition, also starred in such films like The Swiss Family Robinson. He played Carl Robinson in that, John.
Was he the dad?
Yes.
He has hardcore dad face.
Yes.
If I do so.
Absolutely. And
Like, he's got-
hardcore cop face, which makes sense for his TV roles.
Yeah, it works. Do we have anything to add about Mr. Milner? All right, so I think we can move on to the second victim of this week. The character's name is Lily Lasenka, and she is
Great
played
name,
by
by the way.
great name, great you think it's Italian?
That's what I was getting. I was getting vibes of Italian.
That was my vibe as well. Lily Lasenka is played by a woman named Barbara Colby, who was known for TV primarily. Columbo, this episode of Columbo was her first big break.
Yes.
I believe it's her second credit. Post Columbo, she worked on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which, for those of you not in the know, it was a very progressive show for the time. It was like one of the more popular sitcoms of its era, right?
Yeah, it dealt with a lot of themes. Of course, the main one being a woman in the workplace and trying to find equal footing in a man's world, essentially, quote unquote. So very interesting, a lot of great comedy.
Yes.
All the characters in there were excellent. A lot of great chemistry. And if you haven't seen an episode or two, we highly recommend it because it is definitely a great watch.
I have a fun fact about the Mary Tyler Moore Show, incidentally. Ted Knight, who plays like the daffy lead anchorman because he's like just a generic idiot, I guess, for the show. He was the narrator for Super Friends.
Interesting.
So, meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice.
Yep.
That's Ted Knight.
Oh, well, I'll be.
Yeah. Now, from the Mary Tyler Moore Show, Barbara Colby gets a regular part on a spinoff from the Mary Tyler Moore Show, Phyllis, which starred Cloris Leachman, who is one of the funniest women on the face of the earth.
Absolutely.
I always think back to Young Frankenstein. Didn't she played Frau Blucher in that?
Yes, I think you are correct in that, John.
And the horses always ninny when they hear her name. Because her name is because her name, I think, means glue in German.
Yes. It just, oh gosh.
I love Mel Brooks so much.
Just such great writing by Mel Brooks.
And now I'm just thinking of jokes from Young Frankenstein.
Oh my gosh.
The knockers.
Yes, the knockers. The nice soft shoe dance to Putting on the Ritz.
Putting on the Ritz.
Oh my gosh. Hilarious. Classic.
I know. And this is going to be a horrible transition, but
I was going to say, this is going to be a real tough transition here.
Yeah, because unfortunately we have to close out Barbara Colby's story, and it is unfortunately quite tragic. Post an acting class at the age of 36, she was teaching an acting class, and she lived, or that she was teaching, she was tragically gunned down outside of that class. That murder, unfortunately, has been unsolved for decades and is likely to be unsolved. There was no motive, and the investigation was unable to really tie up any kind of connection to why she was shot the way she was, and unfortunately cut short a very interesting career right before it kind of even got a little bit more legs to run with.
Essentially, like, her career was really starting to get up there. Unfortunately, she was taken from this world.
Yeah. But, I mean, she does great work here. I mean, I think, we could talk about her performance a little bit, but there are parts of it I like, and then parts of it that I think are a little bit complicated, but we can get into it as we discuss. The last main cast of this, episode's cast that we'd like to talk about is the wife, the character of Jim Ferris. Her name is Joanna Ferris, and she is played by a woman named Rosemary Forsyth, who coincidentally got her acting debut on Martin Milner's show, Route 66.
A lot of connections.
I know. It's the nature of Hollywood and TV at this time. It's just like if you swing a bat, you're going to hit somebody who was on a bunch of shows with somebody.
That makes a whole heck of a lot of sense. Now, John, Miss Forsyth was in a lot of TV work. Did a lot of TV work, especially all the way into the 90s. But before the 90s, she was in recurring roles of Days of Our Lives from like the 70s to the 80s. She was in The Incredible Hulk for like an episode or two. And then moving on to the 90s, Dharma and Greg, Jag, Ally McBeal, Murder, She Wrote, Dallas. That's more of the 80s, but still Dallas. Yeah. And also talking about the 90s, she starred in an episode of Star Trek Voyager as a doctor working on some genetic research, essentially.
Interesting. But you did not mention one show, and I am surprised you did not mention it. She had a part on Magnum P.I.
She did have a part in Magnum PI. I remember reading that, and I forgot to add it to my show notes. So shame on me.
And this is why we're best friends, because I knew I would have to add it because we both love Magnum PI.
Oh, I love Magnum PI. Oh, my gosh.
Now, another thing about Rosemary Forsyth's career is that she was nominated for a Golden Globe in the movie called The Warlord, starring Charlton Heston. Hello, my name is Charlton Heston. I starred in The Warlord, where I played a medieval knight of the 11th century.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes, indeed.
Chuck Heston, everybody.
Bye. I just felt like possessed by a ghost, and then I just felt compelled.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like when Peter shows up. Peter's actually very polite. He just pops in and just like, hey, can you give me a glass of water? And then,
absolutely.
Anthony, do you have anything to add about our special cast this week?
Nope. We can move right on to the director, the person who wrote this episode, and of course the score.
Yes, indeed, because it is a very interesting director this weekend, very interesting writer this week. They are two very well-known names in the business.
Now, I don't know if I know this director's name. I don't think I've ever heard of him, John.
You know, he's done a couple indie pictures. You know, he's worked a lot, but I don't know if it's anything anybody would know.
One of them was about a shark, right? Something about a shark.
Yeah, and then something about aliens in a couple different instances. He did a couple movies about a guy grave robbing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, okay. What was his name again, this director?
It's
no, Billy, no.
No, I got it right here. I got it. No one's going to know this name. It's a guy by the name of Steven Spielberg.
Steven Spielberg, folks, at age 24, which makes me personally think, what have I been doing with my life?
This is like one of Steven Spielberg's early credits. He was doing a lot of TV stuff early on. Fun fact, and a lot of my information came from the Columbo File and random IMDb trivia, so I would put more credence to the Columbo File more so than random IMDb trivia, because sometimes that proves to not be true.
Yes.
Apparently, Steven Spielberg's directing style at 24 was so aggressive that the studio did not want him back.
Interesting.
It matches what I feel like the TV studios would want. They would want something that's easy to replicate.
Yeah,
they could have directors just come in and out, and they adapt to the show style, and the show doesn't adapt to the director per se.
And that makes a lot of sense now that I'm looking back at the episode and how it's shot and all the pans. Yeah, I can definitely see what you're talking about there, John. But we'll discuss that as we go further into the episode, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, in general, there's a lot of long shots, a lot of long continuous shots, a lot of good use on extreme close-ups and POV shots. A lot of this is based off of Steven's want to immerse his viewers into the world that he's showing them.
Yes.
There's also a lot of on-location shooting, so there's no real, dedicated sets. These are real places that the actors are filming in. There's also a lot of playing with light and shadow, which is what Spielberg is known for. I mean, like the one scene that always pops in my head is like the first time you see Harrison Ford in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where his face is half shrouded in shadow. Another fun fact that I got from the Columbo File: Peter Falk had veto right over the directors.
Yes, and I found that most interesting.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, this is a brand new TV show that only had essentially 2 TV movie pilots. But I mean, Peter Falk was essential to the formation of this character. Plus, he had been in Hollywood at that time for a good chunk of change, so he had some status, he had some clout. So it makes sense that he was able to, pardon the phrase, swing his big Hollywood Johnson around and say, "Excuse me, folks, I want to have all rights. I want to have the ability to say yes or no because at the end of the day, this is something I'm presenting.
Yeah,
This is
and
not
they can't do a
words.
Columbo show without Peter Falk, essentially.
Yeah.
So it makes sense.
And another interesting thing is that Levinson and Link wanted the show to be filmed like Steven was filming it. They wanted it to feel like a movie. They did not want it to feel like a TV show. So it's kind of surprising that Spielberg goes as quickly as he does because he only directs this episode and he never comes back. But I think that's something that we're going to have to look out for as we progress to see. It's just, does it feel like there's a house style for the directing? Does it feel like they're following Spielberg's tempo, as it were? Because I mean, a more modern example is there was a show on before it was the CW, the WB, called Reaper that had its pilot directed by Kevin Smith. So, and the only reason I bring that up is because it's an easy example in that sometimes TV shows will have a notable director come in, film the pilot, and that pilot essentially sets the tempo or the feel for how the show is going to be directed later on. Another example is in NBC's Hannibal, that was produced by Brian Fuller. David Slade, who is known, I believe, primarily as a horror director. He directed 30 Days of Night. He directed the pilot and then did come back for subsequent episodes. But the entirety of that show flows from what he set up in the pilot.
Yeah.
Now, Anthony, do you have anything to add about this unknown director named Steven Spielberg?
No, just a comment more so than added background. It's crazy to think that just a few years after this episode, this was 1971, and then Jaws was 75, I think, off the top of my head, close around to the year 1975. So it's just crazy to think 4 years later, he directs the movie Jaws and literally just blows up from there and is like the quintessential Hollywood director.
Yeah, so you are right. It is 1975. So he filmed.
Hey, kudos to me.
This releases in September of 71. And then 4 or 5 years later, he changes the face of movies with Jaws and then Close Encounters and so on and so on.
But it's interesting to note because, again, Jaws being a Universal product, Columbo at this point in time is still under Universal rule. So Peter Falk essentially opens the door for Steven Spielberg, and then they, I'm assuming that gets the name Steven Spielberg out there into the ears of Universal executives, and then all of a sudden, a couple of years later, we have Jaws, and that essentially sets up Universal and Steven Spielberg for the rest of their lives.
I know. I remember something Peter Falk actually said. I think it might have been in one of his interviews or his memoir that he saw what Spielberg was doing and immediately thought, "Oh, this guy's going places."
Yeah,
and
it shows, John, just in this episode alone. It definitely shows.
All of his tricks are there. It does feel. It's not as energetic as say like Raiders, but that Raiders is a completely different thing. But to see Spielberg's film DNA be so kind of clear at this point, and that's not to say he doesn't grow. I mean, he's going to add tricks as he goes, but
for sure.
It is definitely this episode is a prime example of a director who knows how he wants to present things on screen. Yes. And is incredibly firm about it and knows this has to be the way we do it.
And at age 24, having the insight to just all of this insight and then having the spine to say no, we're actually going to do it my way, which is fantastic. Now, again, this particular episode is by a different author. This time around, John, it's by Steven Bochco. Thank you. Now, John, I know you have a tidbit about Mr. Bochco, so go on ahead.
I got a couple things about Steven Bochco. So Bochco wrote about 7 different episodes, ranging for I think the first 3 seasons of Columbo, and then some of the later TV movies when it goes to I think NBC. The post the cancellation. So he is primarily known for creating a number of police procedurals. Most notably, he was the creator and executive producer on Hill Street Blues, L.A. Law, and NYPD Blue.
Whoa.
Yes, he is very well known in the police procedural genre. He also is the creator of Dookie Howser, MD.
Wow.
Yeah, starring a very young Neil Patrick Harris, where a 12-year-old is a medical doctor because he's apparently a genius.
Because of course it was the 80s, essentially.
Yeah, and you had to have things like that on the air because you needed to fill time. This is also the beginning of Stephen Bochco's close friendship and collaboration with Spielberg. They met, I believe, from what I recall in the Columbo Files, based on my notes. They worked together over the course of 47 years, their entire friendship, until Bochco's death a couple years ago.
Wow, that's amazing.
They started as friends through this, and it carried on 4 decades. That's it. What I have for Bochco. Anthony, you wanted to talk about the score because it's Billy Goldenberg again. That's back.
Yeah, it's Bill Goldenberg again on the score, which he put his name to on our last episode, if you remember.
All 3, I think.
All 3 at this point. Yeah, I was going to say all 3 episodes at this point. And again, it's an excellent score all the way around. Definitely gives it a sinister feel. And I think this was the episode. Again, I love Bill Goldberg's score from the first 2 episodes, and I'm on record essentially as saying such. And by the way, if you're listening now, thank you for listening, rating, subscribing, etc. We appreciate any and all feedback when it comes to Columbo File here. But Bill Goldenberg's score for this one with Steven Spielberg's direction, John, and I think you'd concur on this, it hits a little bit deeper of sinister, especially when Jack Cassidy's on the screen committing the murders and such, or setting up the murders per se. Definitely just hits.
No, absolutely. Did you notice something about the score in certain parts?
I don't think I did, John.
A thing that I learned from the Columbo File, apparently Goldenberg synthesized typewriter typing into the score. So at the beginning, where there's like when you hear that melody, dun 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 dun, and you hear those little clicks, that's a typewriter.
I didn't even pick up on that. That is
I didn't. I wouldn't have picked up on it either if I hadn't checked on that beforehand. So it's just like a little thematic thing to tie into the fact that both of the main characters, being Franklin and Ferris, are writers. So and the first thing that we hear when this episode starts is a typewriter. Now before we get
go ahead.
Yes, I see where you're going, but before we do, I have a couple of little trivia bits for you. Some of this is based off of what's shown on the screen, and it all comes from IMDb trivia, so take it with a grain of salt, apart from what you can see on screen. One of the novels, I believe the one that Franklin gives to somebody in this episode, is titled Prescription Murder, which is...
I was going to mention that when the scene happens, but yes, I found that to be quite interesting. And a nice little Easter egg for the longtime viewers of Columbo at this point. Again, it was been quite a few years.
Yeah, I mean, at least 3?
Yeah, at least 3 to 4, yeah.
Because the first one was 68, and then the first pilot was 71. Another fun fact, this episode, while premiering first, was filmed second. So next week's episode, Death Lends a Hand, was filmed first, but was broadcast on TV after Murder by the Book. And this is typical for how TV was produced and broadcasted back then, because Star Trek is notably an example of being there is a film order and there is a production order. So in Columbo's case, I don't think that necessarily makes much of an impact. In Star Trek, it kind of does, but the episodic nature of Star Trek and Columbo makes it kind of doesn't really matter. But if you want to be a purist about it, you can do it in film order or production order. Now, a fun thing, Columbo's car, this is his first appearance, the Peugeot. Yes, this is the first appearance of Columbo's trademark car, the Peugeot, which is a French car of not great make.
Yes. But
it seems reliable.
I would say it lasted him from 1971 to 2004.
I know, so maybe I'm wrong. Now, the duo that we have here, Ferris and Franklin, is meant to be a reference to Levinson and Link.
Interesting.
You get the alliteration of the two names.
Yeah, the alliteration, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so much, so they're essentially a little bit meant to be poking fun at each other. So much so that Jack Cassidy would joke right before a take, who am I in the scene, Levinson or Link? So, I don't know, seeing as how, I don't know how much writing either of them did, but they are, exec producers for the longest of times, I think, through the entirety of the show. So I imagine they were probably in on the joke.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
So on that note, Anthony, I think we're ready to start our discussion, beginning with Act 1. All right, so we open on a long shot.
A beautiful long shot.
Beautiful long shot. We start with a view of the road on a car that I thought was Columbo and the Peugeot at first.
Yes.
Because it is a convertible. It's a nice looking car. And the long shot starts on the road and then pulls back, and you find that you're in an office where somebody is typing, and all you hear is the sounds of typewriter going. I did not realize that the car that we open on is Ken Franklin, Jack Cassidy. I did not realize that until just now. So we are watching Ken Franklin pull up to the crime scene. What I really appreciate as this episode opens is two things. One is that it is absolutely silent, save for the sound of this typewriter.
Yes.
Which is a brilliant choice, in my opinion. It's just like it immediately kind of sets the tone and puts the focus on what these two people were, which are writers. I mean, you don't get that immediately, but it puts that little specter in the back of your mind. At least I think so.
Yeah. In addition to that, John, what it also does is it starts to set up the chemistry between the two characters themselves. You see Jim, who's the one on the typewriter, hard at work, typing up the story. And then when you look back to the wide shots of Jack Cassidy's character in there, we should probably be referring to him as Ken Franklin at this time.
Yeah, and a thing I wanted to note about Franklin is that I appreciate that you brought up the fact that Ferris is the one doing the work, and Franklin shows up in the swankiest car.
I was just about to mention that. Yep, and then we see Ken roll up, and he's dressed to the nines, the fancy car, the nice suits, the driving gloves, the everything, well done hair. Nice fancy cigarette lighter, and again, it starts to show the two opposites of where these people are on.
Now, fun bit of trivia about what Jim Ferris is writing. He is writing, and this is partly to give background on who these two people are. They are a writing duo who write a series of detective mystery novels, a la Hercule Poirot,
yes.
And Miss Marple, what is the character, their fictional character's name? Mrs. Melville.
Mrs. Melville.
So they are a writing duo who write these mystery novels that are focused on an older woman who solves all of these crimes. And what Ferris is writing at this time is the end of one of their current books, but the solution that he is writing is the actual end of a later episode of Columbo called Dagger of the Mind.
Interesting.
Which, fun fact, it was the one episode that was partially filmed in London.
I really like that episode too.
Indeed. And when we get there, oh boy, are we going to gush? Because if I'm not mistaken, that's the one that Honor Blackman is in, right?
I want to say that is correct.
So they write that's the series that these two write, and Ferris and Franklin are splitting up the band.
Yep.
Ferris wants to go out on his own, and apparently prior to this encounter with Franklin at Ferris's office, it was not very much an amicable split.
Which we find out later through some exposition. But John, when Ken first arrives to the office to meet with Jim, let's talk about how he arrives and knocks on the door, Ken, that is, to Jim.
Yeah, so Ken Franklin comes up to Ferris's office, knocks on the door, and when Ferris opens the door, he comes to Ken Franklin holding a gun on him.
Yes.
And he's very just like surprised, and then he chuckles to himself and breaks down why Ken Franklin isn't going to kill him.
Yes. But what I want to talk about in this specific scene, again, this is an ode to Spielberg and his directing style, is the usage of POV, which to the uninitiated, which is point of view, of just the door opening, and we're seeing the perspective of Jim as he looks onto Ken. So we're seeing literally down the barrel of a gun onto the very stoic Ken's face.
Mm-hmm. And then he breaks down, Ken's gun Ken's trigger finger isn't on the trigger of the gun. He's not wearing gloves. Essentially breaks it seems like it's a fun pastime between the two of them. It's just like, what's wrong with my murder, which is probably part of their writing process. And another thing about this scene before we get into the substance of it, I love how Spielberg seems to be shooting a lot lower and looking up.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. It differs from, the Richard Irving style from the last two episodes, where it feels like it's very much honest, like very static, and they do follow, but it's not as in your face. So like these lower angles that Spielberg is doing makes it feel like, you're like a child sneaking in and looking up and listening in on this. And he's always, I think the one thing I could say is that it feels like the camera's always in motion. Like it's always following whatever is going on in the scene. Now, Anthony, I think we could talk about the substance of why Ken Franklin is at that office.
Yes. So Ken Franklin is at the office because he is writing the finishing touches on their last Mrs. Melville title.
Ferris is, not Franklin.
Ferris. Oh, I'm sorry. I got both of them mixed up. Yes.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
Because, alliteration.
Alliteration, yes. So he's finishing up the last touches on the novel, where Ken is talking about having a nice send-off to an amicable or not so amicable divorce, as he calls it. And literally at one point quotes, "Here's a cheers to our divorce," and hands a glass of champagne over to Jim Ferris. Now,
Franklin tells Ferris, why don't you come up with me to my cabin? We'll celebrate this, the end of Mrs. Melville and the end of our partnership. And there's a thing that we notice, that he leaves his lighter on Jim Ferris's desk, and they go downstairs. They go to get into Ken's car, and he does the whole, "Oh, I forgot my lighter. I'm going to go back up."
Oh, but before he does that, he hands a letter, or hands a note over and says, "Oh, hey, would you mind reading this for me? It's a grocery list." And to which he opens the letter, and by him I mean, of course, Jim Ferris opens the letter and says, "Oh, this is a list of names." And so at that point he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry." Ken goes, "Oh, I'm sorry, it's my mistake," whatever have you, and puts it back in his jacket pocket, all nice and tucked. But also I'd like to note, before he goes back to get his lighter, he's being very pushy as far as trying to get Jim to his San Diego cabin. Extremely pushy. It was very discomforting, which I think, again, with the way this is directed, with those shots coming from the low angle, John, we're seeing, and we're looking up at Ken, and we're seeing him being very sinister. We're starting to see his mannerisms a little bit. We're starting to see okay, this guy's being a little bit too creepy and too pushy on him.
Which, I think in the hands of another actor would have been a little bit more on the nose. I think with the beautiful thing about Jack Cassidy is that charming to him is effortless.
Yes.
That I think that's the recurring part about his performances in the other appearances he has on the show, is that he is effortlessly charming. And as creepy and as pushy as Ken Franklin is being, you buy it, because it does feel like he's just trying to bury the hatchet and heal the rift between these two, because they were at some point friends. They were very close.
Yes.
Like a note I had is like, if this feels like a little bit like Stan Lee, Jack Kirby.
Yeah.
Where
exactly.
Franklin is, not to discredit, because Stan did put in the work, but a lot of the heavy lifting was done by
Jack Kirby.
Jack Kirby, among other artists, depending on whatever collaboration you're looking at that Stan Lee did. So Anthony's right. We have this note, this list that gets folded back in. The lighter's left up there. They go downstairs, and Franklin does the whole, "Oh, I forgot my lighter. I'm going to go get it." And then proceeds to ransack Jim Ferris's office, leave that list. And then there is that shot, Anthony, that you brought up last week of the red herring, which is, it seems like he almost forgets the lighter, And then all of a sudden he goes back, picks it up, and lights a cigarette, and off to the races we go.
Yep.
So we don't know exactly why Franklin has ransacked the office quite yet. We know at some point a killing is going to happen, but the whole part, the part that this plays is still unclear. We come to, following the drive to San Diego, which, I wasn't 100% sure if it was was the cabin in the San Diego area or the LA area?
The San Diego area. They mentioned that he had to drive the outskirts of San Diego. See, they leave it vague, probably on purpose, because that way they don't have to get, written into a corner, essentially.
Exactly. Now, we come across a, small market.
Like a mini mart, essentially.
Yeah. Where we meet Lily Lysenko, who is very much a hardcore fangirl for Ken Franklin.
Exactly. And this is where he leaves Jim in the car, saying, no, don't come out with me, Jim. You go and stay here. I just need some groceries. And so Ken proceeds to go in the mini mart. We're introduced to Miss Lysenko. And he hands her a nice inscribed book, and the said book of Prescription Murder, one of their Mrs. Marvel novels. Melville, excuse me.
Yes, and Lysenko is very, to use a little bit more current term, she's got the thirst hard for Ken Franklin, and she got it hard. And so much so that she's kind of pushing. It's like, well, who's with you this week, the blonde or the brunette? And Ken sets up, oh, no, it's just me, just a quiet weekend up at the cabin, which is part of him forming up his alibi. And then he calls Jim's wife, Joanna, from the market to, tell her that, we're trying to bury the hatchet. I left him at the office.
Yep.
But we are okay, and we're going to meet up for drinks sometime soon. Something along
those lines. Yeah. But and then he double checks with Joanne and says, "Hey, Joanne, I'm going to be in my cabin. You know the number to my cabin, right? In case you need to get a hold of me," which is a little odd.
Yes.
But Joanne thinks nothing of it. Says, "Oh yeah, of course I do, Ken."
And nothing of it, and then he and Jim proceed to drive up. At which point, drive up to the cabin, that is. And at which point, Ferris says, "I have a sense of deja vu. I feel like I've done this before," which we'll get into later on. But that's it. I just wanted to note that for right now, because I honestly thought that was a good little piece of foreshadowing.
Yeah, nice little touch for sure.
So, he was. So they get to the cabin. And again, Franklin is pushy to Jim and say, just call up Joanna, let her know you're going to be working late. You got to meet a deadline. That way we can have our fun time uninterrupted. And he has him call direct, which, for those of you who don't know, that's how, phones used to work back then. You had to call an operator unless you knew the line directly. So, and that's Franklin being clever, so he doesn't create a trail from the phone to the operator to the Ferris house, because that's a record that could be looked up by the police.
Yes. So, John, I'd like to add something at this particular point. So Jim calls and is talking to Joanna, saying, "Hey, I'm working late. Oh, I promised to go out to dinner with you and take you out on this nice dinner, but this is going to be the last time, I swear. The last time I do this." And as soon as he gets that sentence out of "this is the last time, I swear," Ken comes out and shoots him.
Bang, bang.
Bang, bang.
Did you notice the American Psycho style tarp on the couch?
Yes, I did.
I was like, how, as a crime writer, he didn't see the plastic tarp. I'm just like, buddy, you should have been better at your job. You would have seen that coming a mile away.
Well, I also cater that to, it's the joke of oh yeah, grandma always has the plastic on the sofa. so it doesn't get to the sofa. So I think that was just a thing that people did during that era, just to make sure that their furniture, quote unquote, doesn't get messed up. But Ken also does tell Jim that the cabin was recently renovated, which could also lead to disarm him from seeing the couch with the wrapping on it still.
Yes, I agree. Now, Joanna hears the gunshot over the phone.
Which this whole scene breaks my heart, John. And I know I touched upon, like, hey, it's the last time I'm going to call, but hearing that and hearing that foreshadow before he gets shot, just the interaction between, husband and wife and that particular thing, the sweet, the tenderness, which honestly is a huge kudos to Martin Milner in that particular part, because he sells the part of the husband, and just that gunshot when it goes off, literally just my heart sank. Like my heart broke for Joanne at this particular time.
Yeah. But it's all part of Ken's design, that because immediately following the call with Jim where she hears the gunshot, she calls the police.
Yep.
Now,
or she thinks that Jim is in his office.
Yeah, but in reality he is in Ken's trunk. And he stays in Ken's trunk for a minute. We'll come to that, in the following act, but the next scene is the police investigating Jim's disheveled office, and Joanne is standing in the middle of it, being interviewed by two very rude policemen, if I do say so myself.
Oh, very rude. Like, they were giving her the third degree. It's crazy. It was crazy, John.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I understand that the stereotype is that in cases where a husband or a wife is missing, you tend to presume that, if it's the wife, the husband did it. If it's the husband, the wife did it. So maybe that's where these two are coming from. But I mean, I thought that they were being very dismissive of her. They weren't giving her any due credit on, things that might have happened.
Not giving her the benefit of the doubt at all. Just badgering her. Are you sure you heard a phone call? Are you sure this wasn't some practical joke? Are you really sure he said he was going to be here in the office? And just like really grinding her, and to the point where she gets so flustered, she goes, I need to just step outside to get some water. Like, I need air.
And she says, I feel so stupid at one point. It's just like, and this is part of, I think, how the scene is filmed. It feels very oppressive. It feels very chaotic. It feels very claustrophobic, which makes sense because, she's literally freaking out. I have no idea where my husband is. These policemen aren't listening to me. They're pushing. Yeah. I just need to get out of here.
Which, again, this sets up to a great juxtaposition that we will later go into when Columbo first enters the scene. Such a great juxtaposition.
Exactly. So, and at that point, I think, we've hit the end of Act 1, and we will hit Act 2 with the appearance of the Good Lieutenant. And we're back. Now, Columbo shows up 18 minutes in, more or less. And it's a completely different experience than what it was with those policemen inside her husband's office. Anthony, would you like to talk about that?
Complete juxtaposition, John.
Absolutely.
Columbo enters the scene as Joanne is essentially at a water fountain, just trying to get her bearings together, just wrecked out of her mind, just completely trying to figure out, up from down, left from right. And Columbo comes as kind of sneaks up behind her a little bit as Joanne's trying to work this water faucet that's not working, and starts off with, that's kind of the trouble about these fancy buildings, miss. I hope you don't mind. The water fountains never seem to work. Just very disarming, very gentle.
Not talking about the obvious thing, just trying to distract her from it. And I think that's just a reflection of the character, the nature of the character, and yet he knows how to approach the situation and when to be firm, but when also to be gentle and considerate. And this is one of the best examples of him being very considerate to somebody who is clearly having the worst day of their life. Yeah. Like so much so that he offers to take her home and make her food. And Anthony, if I do say so, I want a Columbo omelet now.
Right? That omelet that he starts making. And it was a funny scene. Like, she's obviously taking amusement from it. She's not feeling like this random stranger's in my house.
Because we cut from the office to the Ferris home, and Columbo is just fumbling around the kitchen, just trying to make this woman an omelet. And during this, we learned through some pretty decent exposition, because it's a dialogue while they're just constantly in motion trying to make this omelet. She dismisses the fact that Ken Franklin is a proper partner in the writing duo. He's essentially a partner in name only. He doesn't really actively write. He only did the publicity stuff. Ferris had wanted to leave, and Joanne says that Ken was bitter because it was likely to be revealed that he wasn't much of a writer, and in essence is a fraud. He's not a writer. He never was a writer. Ferris did all the work. And this was part in that, I believe, if I recall correctly, Joanne called Ken to let him know Jim is missing, right?
Well, that was before Columbo entered the scene. But yeah, Joanne did call Ken after Ken essentially rolls the body into his trunk.
Yes, that's something we missed from Act 1.
Yeah, that was something we missed from Act 1. But essentially, yeah, so Joanne and Ken Joanne has already informed Ken about the disappearance. And we see that as Ken enters this scene, pulling up into, and you can tell it's many hours later because it's already dusk. So Ken pulls into the household and knocks on the door. Joanne enters it and they immediately embrace. And Ken is putting on his best, like, oh my gosh, I don't see why this is happening.
And he also says, did they find him yet? Did we find him yet? And to which Columbo says, did somebody tell you he was missing? Columbo's already curious. It's like, why did you immediately presume he's missing?
Yeah.
Also, and this is something I think that came up later, but since we're talking about him driving up, I feel like the cars, Columbo's car and Franklin's car, are a little bit meant to be a parallel between each other, because Franklin he does all the work, all the flash, and Columbo, who does the work, has no flash.
Yeah. And again, they're playing, and again, this is well on the writers as well as Spielberg directing. They're playing that, like I said, it's a parallel but of opposite spectrums.
Yes.
They're playing, they're similar in some cases. They're playing the complete polar opposites, and it's to the credit of Falk and Cassidy's chemistry between one another, which is why he comes back for 6 more episodes after this one, obviously, that just they play so well off of one another, bouncing off and back and forth.
And I appreciate that you said that they're essentially meant to be a reflection of each other.
Yes.
Because where Columbo is very gentle and considerate, in this scene where he first meets the lieutenant, he's very much a bully, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. At one point, he's like, oh, Mrs. Melville would have solved this by now. Like the second sentence he says to Columbo, essentially.
Yeah, and he starts spouting off like he's an armchair Sherlock Holmes and thinking, oh, well, if you were thinking like Mrs. Melville, you would have thought X, Y, and Z. And I feel like he's practically, later on, I think he goes with Columbo to the crime scene and shows him this list that he showed Ferris later, saying that it's a list of, like mob names or something.
Yeah, he starts to spin his story.
Yeah, and the story is so generic. I feel like he's just telling on himself, Yeah. And this is more just my general information. Like one of the names that's mentioned on that list is Westlake. And I immediately thought of Donald Westlake, the crime writer who wrote under his own name and the pseudonym Richard Stark. So I think like Franklin just literally made a list of the biggest crime writers at the time and is just trying to pawn it off to who he thinks is a simpleton Columbo as a list of, oh, well, this is mob. Jim was writing a book about the mob and they got wise.
Yeah. And he's really pushing and spinning this story. and being very flashy about it in proper
yeah.
Kin style, like the letter he pulls out of the drawer. And again, this is the same letter that he had Jim touch in the first scene that we saw the two in that we previously mentioned. And
which Franklin also mentions, Jim and I were in this office all the time. Of course, our fingerprints are going to be on this.
Yeah, exactly.
And is it here that Columbo mentions the nature of how that thing is folded?
Yes, it's exactly in this scene.
Okay, would you want to talk about it? Or?
Absolutely. So essentially, Ken pulls this letter out in very grandiose style, hands it to Columbo and say, look, this is a list of all the major mob bosses from here to call San Francisco Frisco, which I found interesting. From here to Frisco to Miami. Mm-hmm. So there's this, let's follow this angle. Here it is. And Columbo goes, well, that's kind of odd because it's folded in a way you would keep it in your breast pocket. And from what I know, from what I know, Jim isn't the kind to fold a note and slide it simply into the desk. He was leaving notes unbent everywhere.
That's a fact that Joanna gives Columbo when they're making this omelet. It is that Jim, the nature of how Jim created was that he always had ideas spark and would just write it down on anything he could get his hands on. Not necessarily a nice folded piece of paper. It could be a matchbook. It can be something. It could be a piece of newspaper, anything.
And the thing I found interesting to add to the scene, John, was that he spins his story to Columbo and then hands him a giant stack of Mrs. Melville novels and says, I bet you weren't expecting a gift tonight. Here you go, and tries to get him the hell out of the office.
Yeah, it's like he figures, here I gave you the best present you'll ever ask for. Here's some more presents. Don't bother me anymore. Look at how clever I am.
Yeah. And then is about to shut the door on Columbo. Columbo turns and gives another, hey, one more thing. And he gives a glaring look at Ken and says, I had a thought. Why would you drive from San Diego back to L.A., whereas in hearing this news, just take a flight? It would have been a lot of time saver just to do so. And then Ken doesn't know what to respond to that. And this is where Ken starts to pick up on the cleverness of Columbo. He doesn't know how to respond to that and goes, oh, well, he's blustering at this point going, well, with as much time as you spend driving to the airport and then driving out of the airport, who says it would have been even faster? Ha, ha, ha.
He also makes reference to something that has happened before from a murderer. I believe Lee Grant in last week's episode that, sometimes an emotional response just comes into play. You don't necessarily think logically, whereas, in this case, the logical thing would be to go take a plane from San Diego to Los Angeles.
Exactly.
But, I think that's going to be a recurring theme throughout this, but we'll see as we progress through these 60 some odd episodes now.
Exactly. But one thing before we move on from this scene and from the interaction of this bogus story that he spins for Columbo, as far as not flying and instead driving, Columbo doesn't give a oh yeah, that sounds about right, like he normally does. He doesn't give an affable shoulder shrug or of course. He just goes, huh, and gives him an odd look and then just walks out of the office, walks away from the office.
Now, two things. One, I just love once Columbo walks away, I just love Cassidy's face and how it's lit in that scene. And
yes.
You just see his face just drop to the ground and it's lit. So the shadow just falls on his face so well that you can immediately see, oh, this guy knows it's kind of starting to crumble.
And again, that's a credit to Spielberg and his start. You can see him experimenting with shading, shadows.
Exactly. And at this point, I'd like to just check in on whether or not Columbo suspects at this point.
Yes, and he mentions later on this episode that this is where he really starts to suspect him. He starts to mention that's the little things that started adding up in this case, and the first major little thing that added up was him not taking a flight to L.A. and the bogus story that Ken gave him.
Exactly. Now, the body finally shows up, and we learn that Ken has dumped Ferris right onto his own driveway, meaning Franklin's. It's literally his own front lawn. Yeah. He picks up his mail, and while he's rummaging through his own mail, Franklin calls, the police department in Columbo and says, "You better come over here." And we cut to, the giant scene of finding the body on his front lawn. And we get a better glimpse of Ken Franklin's house, which is filled to the brim with fine art. It's a pretty big house.
Yep.
It's very reflective of its owner, very flashy, very expensive. And Columbo starts asking questions. It's just like, it's obvious you like the fancy stuff, but what's the upkeep like? What's going to happen to Jim's money and the insurance once he, do you get anything? It's like, I don't get any royalties, but insurance possibly, because they did put something out on each other.
And not only that, but and then on top of that, I should say, Ken again starts to really push his angle of this being a hired killer. Really starts to
it's a hired mob killer.
Yeah. And they try to make a statement to me by throwing his body into my lawn. And Columbo's like, "Well, did you have to take a part in this so-called new novel?" And Ken's like, "Oh, no, this was all Jim's baby. I had no idea about it."
Yeah, and Columbo's just like, "Well, they wouldn't have known that you were splitting, so it makes sense that they would drop it off, I guess, to warn you. But I mean, it wouldn't make sense otherwise."
Nothing adds up, and then he starts going into things that don't make sense, which he goes into Ken rummaging through his letters as he's on the phone.
He doesn't know that Ken was rummaging through the letters necessarily. But the first thing he does is say, why would a pro, leave the body? Why would they go through the effort of making that kind of a message? The killing itself is the message. Why would they care to dump the body? And Franklin is, trying to just cover for himself as this story is crumbling around him.
Yeah, and he's not doing a good job at all.
Which is reflective on how bad he is. He's not a creator. He does not have the substance needed that would be that Ferris had. He didn't do the work to be clever enough to create a story like this. And then Columbo notices the letters and is just like, "What did you open this while you were, after you found the body?" And Franklin said, he needed a distraction. That's his excuse. "I needed a distraction to keep myself busy, so I didn't think about the body on my ground," which
Columbo totally sees through that BS, because he's like, "Well, I suppose bills are very distracting." And again, just gives not even an affable, like, "Oh yeah, makes total sense," just another little thing piling up. Another little thing where Columbo's like, "No, this just doesn't sit right. No normal human being would do this."
Now, this is where I think he's finally cemented, "Oh, it's this guy."
Yeah.
This is the absolute moment where he's just like, "Okay, it's Franklin. I just need to get enough on him to see, to finally get him pinned for this."
Yeah.
We cut to Columbo getting a hot dog.
Yeah, next day.
After he leaves, the next day, he's talking to an insurance broker, and they get a hot dog because he's buying him lunch. And I guess essentially it's a very brief scene. It doesn't really...
Very brief, like less than 3 minutes, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's essentially just Columbo information gathering, which, to my knowledge, based off of the rest of the series, you don't necessarily see him do this kind of police legwork. But I could be wrong, and I will
not very much. I would say it's very rare to do this kind of a legwork. Typically, he gets it through exposition, through characters, as far as gaining information and intel. But in this particular scene, he literally is like, "Oh yeah, you're the insurance broker that gave the insurance claim to Jim and Ken, aren't you?" And the insurance broker's like, "No, I can't talk about that. Client privilege, et cetera, et cetera." And then Columbo just hits him with like, "Oh yeah, hey, I don't want to get you in trouble. I'll just go get a warrant." And then you see the deadpan of the face of the insurance broker. And that was the last thing you see in this scene, but it is imposed that he gives up the information that Columbo needs.
Which, to be quite honest, I hope isn't the case, because, I hope Columbo just went and got the warrant. But,
yeah,
I mean, I would understand, in Hollywood, it would make sense. It would be more it would be faster to say, just tell me what you need to know and we don't have to deal with the courts. But my head being, having the training I had, it's just like, no, do it the proper way. Otherwise it won't stand up in court.
Exactly.
So we cut to the next scene is we come across Ken Franklin at a play with a young lady. And Lily Lysenko has come up from San Diego and is watching the play too, and very, very publicly tries to get his attention and succeeds. And the one thing I loved about this scene is that it shows Franklin as in my opinion, a textbook narcissist, because
Yes,
he's
agreed.
talking with his date, and he's just showing off. He's just like, yeah, no, I saw it I saw the twist coming from a mile away. I would have done it so much better. Blah, 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 blah. Would you like dinner? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then essentially the one thing, again, in true narcissistic fashion, his date says, "Oh, well, I was completely surprised," and he looks disgusted at his date and says, "Oh, that's just because you're young." And I'm like, "Ooh, what a backhanded comment there."
It's like, lady, you can do so much better. What I also appreciated is that, Lily's got some edge to her.
Oh yeah.
Like, you're going to want to have to hear what I have to say, Mr. Franklin.
She starts off sweet and says, "I was hoping we can get a drink." And he
Mhm.
goes, "No, I'm with this date. Not at all. This isn't a good time." And she's like, "Well, you're going to want to hear what I have to say." And then again, Ken is trying to be like, "No, okay, I'm here with somebody else." And she goes, "Well, it's about a story I have." And essentially through this clever way she says it, she says that she has information leading to the crime against his business partner, Jim.
Yes. Now, I have a question, and I wanted to see what you thought. Do you, we learn later what she's really trying to get out of him, but do you feel like at first she's just using this purely as leverage for romance?
Yes.
Because that was like the strongest vibe throughout all of it. Even later when we find out more information, she's just like, "No, I want you in my bed. You're going to do this because I have this on you, and we're going to do this because of that."
Yes.
That changes later on, and we learn in there, because it goes to them having dinner and her telling her story, which is that she peeked out the window to see what woman Franklin was with when he came in right before he killed Jim, and she saw Ferris and didn't think much of it at the time until she saw, writer Jim Ferris has been found dead, or was missing, presumed killed. And she says she doesn't go to the police because she didn't want Franklin to get in trouble. What do you think about that?
So I think, again, it's just playing the angle that she's infatuated with him because, again, he is this Hollywood star. He is this, great-looking man who's well-to-do, well-dressed. And I think she's just wanting this relationship that she's built up in her own mind that they have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you feel like it was a little bit we could talk about stan culture, I guess. It's like she's her fandom for him has progressed to an almost borderline stalker-ish, at least in my estimation. I think she knows there's a limit, but it feels a little bit intense, at least until we figure out her true meaning for putting this over on him. Which is,
again, I don't think she thought that particular thing all the way through, because at first she's just enjoying the dinner because they're at dinner discussing this, and she's not bringing up the topic, he's not bringing up the topic, they're just doing this nice social dinner. And it's not until Ken's like, "Okay, what are you after?" where she nervously is like, and she spills her drink on the table when she's mentioning $15,000. Again, a trivial amount to Ken, we let her find out. But again, I don't think she fully formed this blackmail money avenue up until Ken was pushing her to say, "Okay, what do you want? Is this about money? How can I pay you off?"
Yeah, and I think she was you're right. She's so focused on getting that physical attention from him that she so desperately wants that the money seems almost incidental, which is I think I think that's one of the flaws of this episode is that she pivots between these two things. It's either you want one of them or you want the other one. You can't. I don't know if you necessarily can have both. Does that make sense?
No, that makes total sense. And one thing I wanted to touch upon, because again, we're mentioning $15,000. Well, if you account for today's money,
oh boy,
via inflation, we're talking about $95,000. Yeah, it's approximately 95,963, roughly. I'm rounding up a little bit, but yeah, so that's what essentially you're looking at. So again, just a little fun fact about inflation rates from 1971 until this year,
today.
2020. Yeah.
Yeah, and if we could talk about Colby's performance here, it's like I do like what she does with the Lysenko. I do feel like it's probably one of the weaker parts because I feel like they don't, and it goes back to my feeling that they can't have it where they can't have it both ways. Where she wants to sleep with him and she also wants money from him. And I feel like you can feel that in her performance. Where
I think it was purely romantic until Ken pushed her at this dinner. Because automatically his mind went to like, okay, I just have to pay her off. So he was leading her for a dollar amount to get paid off. I can't remember the exact verbiage he used in this dinner, but from what I recall, it's him really pushing like, okay, how much money do you want? And that's when she nervously was like, God, I didn't think this through. Spills the cup and says 15,000. Like it was just the first number that popped in her head.
Yeah, and then from this dinner, they make the agreement. We're going to do he's going to do the payment. The next day, we cut to Columbo coming into Franklin's house, and he's in the midst of a media interview with a lovely young woman and a photographer. And Columbo's just carrying all these Mrs. Melville books, to return the book, presumably to return the books to Ken Franklin. And he notices, 2 bottles of champagne before he walks in on Franklin's interview, and he sees Franklin flirting with the interviewer and being a gigantic douchebag as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, he is and she's asking, okay, well, what does this mean for the novel going forward, the Mrs. Melville series? And he goes, I wouldn't feel comfortable writing about without Jim, so I'm going to bury Mrs. Melville where I bury Jim, and I don't even think I want to write anymore to cover up his inadequacies of not even being an adequate writer.
Yeah, so at this point we can glean that his motive for Jim's murder is that, aside from any money he might get from insurance, he gets to retire from the writing game with dignity.
Exactly.
And his pride and his wealth, whatever that may be, and we do learn some things about that later on, if I recall. Those things will remain intact. Now, I want to talk about how Franklin reacts to Columbo, because he is, meaning Franklin, he is royally pissed, in my opinion.
Him. Yeah.
Yes. And he does not do a great job of showing his growing irritation at Columbo. And Columbo here is just, to essentially return the books and also give an update as to the movement on the case.
Yeah.
Which, at this point, Franklin thinks that Columbo is following the mob angle, which would be notoriously difficult to follow anyway.
Yeah. And not just that, but when Columbo starts to touch on other angles outside of that one, he tries to shepherd him back. He's like, well, you should really follow Mrs. Melville, and she would have already done this angle and that angle. This seems counterproductive. You need to really press this, which, again, it's just really off-putting.
And Columbo's also very generous and complimenting the Melville stories and saying that they are fantastic. And an attempt, I think, to partially butter up Franklin to see if he can get something out of him.
Yeah.
He also mentioned Columbo does ask him, what are you doing with 2 bottles of champagne? And Franklin gives an excuse that honestly I don't really remember because it
was something like, I'm going to go to my cabin and I can put down 2 bottles of champagne plus more by myself, essentially.
And Columbo mentions the call from the cabin, I lost my tongue there for a second. Forgive me, folks. Columbo mentions the cabin to the Ferris household call, which is in reality the store call, and Franklin again brushes it off as something that's like, of course they knew how to get a hold of me, and it's all set up so that he can tie it to Jim's call to Joanna from the cabin.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all just subterfuge to disguise the fact that that when Joanna talked to him, it was from Lysenka's store, not from the cabin.
Exactly. And from here, essentially, after this particular scene, we jump into
sunny San Diego, California.
Yes, sir. And Ken driving up to the same little mini mart to go meet Lily and give her the $15,000.
And when he shows up, she is thirsty.
Yeah, she essentially melts. And then, he puts a suitcase on the counter and says, okay, here you go. And she goes, and again, which makes me think that this is just purely romantic and not for money. She looks at the suitcase and goes, oh, yeah. Almost like I forgot this was a part of the arrangement.
Yeah, and they proceed to have a night drinking champagne and dinner, which apparently is in the back. With her house is adjoining with the market. Yeah. And they've tied one on. It seems like he is handling his liquor very well, and she is not. Yeah. But I think she is definitely very more self-aware than I think Franklin would give her credit, because there's a couple things that she says, and I think it also goes to enforce your theory that the money was completely incidental to whatever romantic interest he had. She goes from she says, I don't know if I can trust you, in regards to her being tipsy and not drinking anymore. And then she changes her tune and says, I trust you, but it wouldn't be intelligent of me to be with you on a small boat, when he tells her, let's go out on the lake and go for a swim. A romantic moonlight stroll on the lake that is the drawing point for this little tourist trap.
Yeah, exactly. Which she knows something's up, even being inebriated. Refuses it profusely, and then Ken essentially plays the victim and says, oh, you wound me. Well, here, let's talk about the money. Why don't you go look at the money? To which, Lily goes and looks at the money. He wraps a cloth around one of the bottles of champagne. And in this particular shot, he goes to strike Lily. But again, we get another nice POV scene, but this time from the perspective of Ken as he's striking Lily. You don't actually audibly hear her scream. You just see her, again, great acting skills as far as being frightened and just shrieking to the point where it fades off and you can tell that Ken has, struck her, done a killing blow with this bottle of champagne.
Yeah, it's an entirely wordless scream that, from my research, was meant to be by Spielberg a Hitchcock reference to Psycho.
Yes, to Psycho, yep.
So,
exactly.
And at this point, with the murder of Lily Lysenka, we can conclude Act 2 and move into the final act of the episode.
But before we do, we should mention that Ken takes this body to a boat, goes out to the middle of the lake, dumps the champagne bottles, dumps the body, and flips over the boat and swims promptly to the shore. And again, swims in these very tight 1970s trousers, if you will.
Yeah, it's like the implication is, the boat capsized and that she drowned. So, with that, thank you for saving me, Anthony. We move on to Act 3 and the catch, if you will. Now, we come to the next morning post the Lysenko murder, and everybody is like wondering what happened. They see that a boat had sunk, and they're not sure why the police are investigating. And they hear, there's a bunch of rumors going around, and you see Franklin, in like a fishing outfit, jeans and a
Just
and
trying
a cap.
to blend in.
Just like pretending to be, the one of the local tourists. Just like, what happened here? Did something happen? And essentially just checking up on his crime. And he gets confirmation she's dead, and he goes back to the cabin because he knows that they're not going to be fishing in that lake. After finding a body.
Yeah.
So he goes back to the cabin only for Columbo to show up. And I gotta say, Columbo's appearance is like he shows up like a ghost. He comes out of nowhere.
Yeah,
it's great.
Comes out of nowhere and just knocks on the back door to the cabin, which startles Ken. Because again, it's like this specter is haunting him at this point, essentially.
Yeah, and Columbo talks about how I just came up here because you mentioned it so many times, and I could use a vacation, so I figured I'd look at this place, and maybe me and my wife can come up here
again. And he's being his total Peter Falk, that is, being his total affable Columbo, like, oh, this is a great place to vacation. What do you think about the area here? To which Ken goes, well, there's no nightlife, so that's a drawback, and plus I don't think you could even afford a place out here, Columbo, because these places typically are already rented, and it's way above your salary. Just really snubbing his nose down.
Yeah,
to Columbo.
Just really punching down, saying, you can't. You're a policeman. You can't do what I do.
Yeah, but the no nightlife thing is an interesting line.
Yes.
Because Columbo goes, well, that's interesting, Ken. Because again, this is being the clincher, says, that's funny because I rang last night to tell you I was coming, and nobody was home here.
Isn't that interesting? And there's also a conversation about the body found at the lake and whether or not Franklin knew Lysenko. And he's just like, well, yeah, I didn't know her. It's like, well, you were here. She had the only grocery store in town. You had to have, seen her. It's like, well, yes, of course. He gets Franklin in that little trap. It's just like, yes, you knew her. You're saying that, you only just barely interacted with her, which we then go to the investigation by the local sheriff of the Lysenko scene or the Lysenko market, and Columbo gets his way in by telling the sheriff, "Hey, I'm LAPD. Can I look?"
Yeah, and it was a really nice touch because he could have done the stereotypical cop thing, say, "Look, I'm LAPD, homicide. I want to go and I need to investigate." But no, he's like, "Hey, would you mind if I take a look? I'm here in this area because of another murder." And the sheriff or one of the sheriff's men there was like, "Yeah, I just don't see a problem whatsoever. Yeah. Go ahead, take a look, do whatever you need to do."
I mean, dude, I was surprised that there was an interdepartment cooperation like that because I know based off of a little bit more modern police procedurals, whenever one department, a police department comes in contact with a sheriff department and there's a issue of jurisdiction, then they get all kind of wishy-washy. So I was a little surprised that I'm assuming the deputy just was like, "Yeah, no, go ahead. I don't see a problem."
Well, I think it's just because Columbo came off as like, "Hey, this is I know it's not my jurisdiction," and he literally says, "I'm out of my jurisdiction here. I know this is all you guys, but I would still like to take a look because it might help in another murder I'm investigating." And I think because he is already bowing down and saying like, "Look, I know I'm not supposed to be here. I know this is your guys' thing. I don't want to intrude, but I'd like to take a look if that's okay because it might help with this other case." And I think that's why the sheriff there was like, "Yeah, no, Columbo, you do what you got to do. Go on ahead. I give you my blessing for it."
Now, in Columbo's investigation of the market,
inside of the market,
he checks the back, the back part of the building, which is where Lily lived, and he's rummaging around, he's looking for things, and then out rolls one of the champagne corks, and Columbo picks it up and is just like, huh, this is interesting. Probably remembering, wait, the last time I saw champagne was Ken Franklin.
And he smells the bottle cap, and it's a very recent smell, so you could
Yeah.
just tell that it was just open, not just a few hours ago, essentially.
Yeah, it was probably less than 24 hours that cork had been inside of a bottle. And he wanders to the behind the stand of the cashier stand, and there's a bunch of books that Lysenko just has like lying out. One of them, which is the signed book by Ken Franklin, Prescription Murder, and it is a very intimate inscription on the book. So immediately Columbo realizes, oh, he knew her pretty well. He knew her well enough to give her a very intimate inscription on this autograph book, or this autograph book. And this whole time we're getting the opposite perspective from the sheriff being interviewed by the local media, who is presuming, there's no foul play. There's nothing. I don't see any indication that this wasn't anything beyond an accident.
And the reporter's like, well, there was a blow to the head. And the sheriff's like, oh, yeah, but the boat capsized, so it just popped her in the head, and that's what caused everything.
And it's a great juxtaposition up against what Columbo does in the next scene. And it makes me recall something, I believe that's essentially a Sherlock Holmes quote. I'm going to butcher it a little bit because I don't have the exact quote. But, it sounds like the sheriff is changing the facts to suit his theory instead of, his theories to suit the facts, exactly, which is what Columbo is doing. So, whereas the sheriff is saying, oh, she has a blow on her head because the boat capsized and probably conked her on the noggin. Columbo, with the additional information that he has based on the facts, there's a champagne cork. I know that my suspect had some champagne. Yep. And he wrote her a very lovely autograph. There's something here. I just don't have to finalize it.
It was to Lily, best regards, love always, Ken. Like something very intimate
like that. And the reason I bring up this theory thing is because Columbo then the next scene following Columbo leaving San Diego is him telling Joanna, it's Ken. Here's how it is. I don't know how to prove it, but if you look at all the facts, everything comes together.
All these little pieces start to coming, and under the guise of knowing it's Ken who did it, these little tidbits of information that I've gathered start to make sense and start to add up to the murderer. But what I need the solid, the smoking gun. Like I need the solid proof. So tell me everything you know about Jim. Just tell me anything, and I just need to think this through. And so Columbo's like really pondering, really thinking in like the living room or the study of Joanna's house, and Joanna's just going and talking about Jim, talking about how he wrote everything down. She means every little thing
on anything. That ties back to what we mentioned earlier. It's just like the moment he had an idea, he just found something to write it on and wrote it down. And it's another comparison between Franklin and Ferris, where Ferris was always coming up with something. His brain was always in motion about how he was creating another story. And whereas Franklin only ever seemed to think about Mrs. Melville and the stories when he was talking about it on television. Yeah. Very much, a proto Stan Lee type thing. This, again, not to knock on Stan Lee. Again, Stan Lee is essentially a character as well as a person. Now, I think, Anthony, we can move on to the last part of this episode, the catch itself. We come to Franklin pulling up on the site, the building where Jim's office is, and there's a moving truck just idling outside, and he comes up to ask, are they moving stuff out of there yet? And he's like, I've been here. The driver says, I've been here a half hour. They haven't done anything. Take it up with them upstairs. And when Franklin walks in, his pretense towards Columbo is gone. He's like, what the hell are you doing here?
Yeah. And again, there's multiple officers in the room. You can tell Columbo's gone through and looked at every single little scrap of paper in there that he could get his hands on.
Mm-hmm. And there's another trick that I think I want to attribute to Spielberg, and I hope so, but when Franklin walks in, you see those extra police officers kind of just position themselves. They just turn around and watch and look, and it's a great sense of oppression and claustrophobia, because it's literally the screws tightening on Franklin. Yep. I feel
exactly.
So Columbo breaks down his feelings on what Franklin did. So Anthony, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So essentially, after examining every scrap of paper in the old office, Columbo is essentially saying that the first murder he gives him credit for, because it was well thought out, well planned, everything was well executed, which made him think like this had to have been something that you could not have come up with. So it got him to thinking that Jim came up with this of a plot point.
Yeah, he even goes to say that, you had me going in such circles, Mr. Franklin.
Yep.
That was Peter, everybody came to say hi.
And by going, and again, giving him credit, you had me going. So that's when I thought it had to have been Jim's idea. And Columbo essentially tells Ken that he searched every scrap of paper to find the idea of the plot behind this quote unquote perfect alibi.
Exactly.
Person A goes to person B to whisk them away, to call person B's spouse, and again, just perfectly highlights how the crime was done.
Yeah, and the reason Columbo is doing that is because the second murder was sloppy.
Very sloppy.
It was sloppy. It was impulsive. It wasn't as organized, and that led Columbo to think, here's one person, the creator, Ferris. That's his idea, and Franklin is stealing it or taking claim for it like he did for everything else. And the second one is pure Franklin, which is all just cliche. It's messy. It's sloppy. It's obvious. And Columbo breaks it down. It's a mixture of driving up from San Diego. It's opening the mail when you have a body out and on your front lawn. It's no emotional response at him being found. It's the insurance. It's the $15,000 that was moved out of the account and put back into his account. It's Lysenka being killed. It's Lysenka having a book that was signed intimately by Ken Franklin. All of these little things. It's the little things that bother me. It's the little things. And I love David Cassidy's performance when he got.
Yeah.
Because do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, because again, he's going David Cassidy, no, Jack Cassidy.
Did I say David?
No, I think I did. I screwed it up. So, edit point. So Ken Franklin, played by Jack Cassidy, at this particular scene is playing his normal smug, like you have nothing, you don't even have a motive, and that's when Columbo starts chip by chip breaking him down and saying, "Nope, I have this. Your motive was the insurance money. Your motive was if Jim would have keep on writing, you would have found out that you can't do that. You're not an author. You're not a creative person, and you would have been called a phony and have no future." And then again, all these little tit for tats, until finally Jack Cassidy, you can just tell from his facial expressions, just drops it and goes, "You know what? The best," because again, Columbo's like, "No, the second murder was you because it was sloppy. The first murder was planned out. That was Jim." And to which Jack Cassidy goes, "You know what the funniest part is?" He finally breaks and goes, "No, the first murder, I came up with this idea and gave it to Jim a long time ago for a plot of a book." He's like, "Who would have known that son of a bitch would have just wrote it down?" I think he actually uses those exact words.
Yeah, he's like so surprised. He's just like, yeah, who would have known he would have wrote it down? He's like, it was the one good idea he had, and he thought it was the one thing he would have over Jim, that Jim never would have guessed it. But I mean, you get that earlier on with Jim saying, "I've got a feeling of deja vu."
Yeah, exactly, which is the callback to what we mentioned earlier in this podcast.
And speaking of deja vu, Anthony, I've got a feeling of deja vu myself. I think we're at the end, and I think it's just time for one more thing.
I'm so sorry to bother you. Just one more thing.
So my final thoughts, my one more thing, John.
Just one more thing. Just one more thing. I'm sorry to bother you, folks. Just one more thing. Anthony, take it away with just one more thing.
Technically, it's three more things. So
Yes.
the first of highlight to note is just how this was directed, how this episode was directed. The use of long shots, the use of, the point of view shots, like the second murder, the inaudible scream, was fantastic, and I can't highlight that enough.
Agreed. That's to give credit where credit is due. The genius, I guess, that is a 24-year-old Spielberg, and having producers and a star that trusted him to do the job that he was hired for, and to innovate and do something that was not typically seen on TV. It's.
And again, it wasn't just on Spielberg, right? A lot of this was the writing themselves, or the writing of Bochco, like Steven Bochco. Just with knowing who his actors were, knowing how they would interact, which leads into my second point of the chemistry between Peter Falk and Jack Cassidy. Their chemistry was just electric on screen. You can definitely tell, again, playing a mirror off of one another. Their nonverbals were great. Their little tit-for-tat sparring, their verbal sparring they did was excellent. All the way until Columbo finally puts the screws into him at the end, John.
No, I agree. I think what we're seeing here is Peter Falk, just coming out the gate, understanding how this character ticks to the every single tick mark. He knows what he needs to do, and what he needs to do to make people assume this about him or assume that about him. And he knows when Columbo would pull it all down and say, I got you.
Yeah.
I think, Falk is always a standout. And you are right, Anthony, there is a reason Jack Cassidy returns, 6 other times. He is an electric performer. He is a dynamo a dynamo of charisma, and it always shows. And honestly, it's a phenomenal open for a TV series. I mean, you could skip Prescription Murder and Ransom for a Dead Man, and still just come in and understand exactly how Columbo works, how the murders typically work. I loved that Spielberg was innovating, and it feels modern. All of these tricks of his have just wormed their way into filming and filmmaking. Billy Goldenberg's score is honestly a standout. It's just clever to tie it in thematically, and I'm curious to see how many times he comes back and how many times he's able to pull off tricks like the typewriter into the score, like he did here. And credit to Martin Milner, who and Rebecca Forsyth, because I do agree, Anthony. There is a great, even though they don't share the screen immediately with each other, they do sell, a very loving couple who understand how the work is done. And unfortunately, I would have liked to have seen more from Barbara Colby, apart from her role as Lily Lysenko. As frustrated as I can be with how she performed it, because at times it feels a little bit too I don't know what the exact reference is, but she's too boy crazy. It seems.
Yeah, too like fangirl over.
Like, ooh, a man.
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It verges on that a little too much for me at times, but I mean, it's what the story requires. Franklin needs that obstacle of to kind of set it all home. And I think with that, it's time to go home, Anthony.
Absolutely, John. So, loyal listeners at home, we thank you for listening. We thank you for rating, subscribing, spreading the word. If you like this, we also have our other podcast that John and I do, Ludic Lounge Cast. And of course, our friend Peter Falk at the end of this episode will give you all the plugs you need for that. So, John, set us off as only you can tonight.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been another episode of the Columbo Files brought to you by the Ludic Lounge. I am your host, John Soares, and on behalf of my brother from another mother, Antonicus Gluteus Maximus IV, thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, this is Peter Falk, and you've been listening to an episode of the Columbo Files, hosted by the Ludic Lounge. And just one more thing. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Ludic Lounge, Anthony at RojoLoco44, and John at just_John_0891. Or feel free to email us at theludiclounge@gmail.com.